everyone. Welcome to Cafe Libellus, where I, Kristen, review books in the most comfortable way I know possible. Today, that's nice oolong. Today I'll be reviewing the book Gardens of the Moon, first in the series of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is by Steven Erikson. It was published in 1999 by Tor Books. And it surrounds a cast of characters in a fantasy land. These characters are, for the most part, members of the Malazan Empire on this foreign continent called Genebacus. And the Malazan Empire is trying to conquer this continent of Genebacus, and they've mostly succeeded, except for one city called Darujistan. And because this is the last city that they're all planning on conquering, a lot of the plot threads and characters end up in Darujistan, and many people collide. So perhaps you can tell from the very foreign place names that I mentioned in the summary, this is a high fantasy novel. So right away, if you're not a fan of high fantasy, this may not appeal to you. But I personally am very much a fan of high fantasy. I love how the lore and world building is very intricate at times, and it's almost like learning a new culture. My first impression, just given based on the cover art, was that this would be a darker and grittier fantasy tale. And so I had actually been recommended this book multiple times by different friends over many, many years, but because I'm lazy, I have not read it until now. Going into it, I knew there was going to be a steep learning curve because most high fantasy and some sci-fi have entire new worlds that need to be introduced. And sometimes the author helps you along the way. They provide a glossary, they provide exposition where a lot of the new terms and rules of this world are laid out. Steven Erikson doesn't really do that. He does not hold your hand when it comes to things like exposition or defining new terms, new words, new peoples. And because of that, the learning curve is steeper than some other fantasy books I've read. If it's difficult for you to follow along and figure out for yourself how this world works, and to keep track of all the different principles and characters and rules in a regular high fantasy with a lot of exposition, this will definitely be very difficult to read. I would get halfway through the book and realize that something introduced in the first chapter, I wouldn't understand what it actually was until much later in the book. There is a glossary provided by Erikson in the back, but again, it doesn't really help you until you're much further in the book because a lot of the terms used to explain other terms are not explained until much later. So it's a very active read, and you need to be constantly trying to figure out what all of these terms mean in the midst of keeping track of characters, keeping track of events, things like that. Now, aside from that, I consider that a very technical aspect of this book. And I think the other very technical aspect that I personally took issue with, but others might not, is the way Erikson develops his characters. He has a habit of telling us how the characters feel through their thoughts. And this is very useful in the beginning of the book when you're trying to establish characters and get the reader to know them better so that later down the road you can have more gradual development or the reader can understand where they're coming from. And so I don't necessarily have a problem with exposition about how a character feels. Personally, I like it more when there is a gradual development, when it's slow and natural, so that by the end of the book, even if it's not obvious how they've changed, you know that they have, and that they've grown into a different character. The way Erikson develops his characters is very direct. He states how the characters think and feel during and after an event. And while this may be fine in the beginning of the book, this happens throughout, even up to the end. You have repeated instances of development that have already occurred, and you realize, wait, I read about this 200 pages ago, and you still have the same conflict, and you're still framing it in the same way. I feel as though now, because there is no outward change, and because the same development is being repeated throughout the book, that these characters are not actually developing. They're in a constant state of almost developing. And so, to give an example, there is a particular character called Lorne. She's introduced pretty much from the beginning of the book. And she's like a typical, like, tough girl, plays by the rules, but is also super smart sort of character. And she is basically the Empress of Malazan's right-hand man. But one of the first signs of her significant development is on page 285. She's visiting a cohort of people who are running the military campaign on the continent of Ganabakis. And she realizes that one person in this cohort is the same person that basically made her lose her family when she was young. This is a quote from page 285. He just witnessed an execution. The woman named Lorne had risen from the turgid mists of the past, risen to right a wrong, to find justice, and in the last act reclaim its life. And she had been denied. Not by the words of Dujek or Taishran, but by the thing known as the adjunct. And so that is the first instance of character development in Lorne. And as you can see from that, this isn't even from Lorne's perspective. You can tell from the outside that there's this inward battle going on, and that Lorne has succumbed to the title of adjunct, the title of being the Empress's right-hand man. And so this, onward, you would expect Lorne to give more of a dogged pursuit of the Empress's wishes as is part of her mission. And so we essentially see Lorne cutting herself off personally from certain events, and the adjunct, her position, takes over. She shuts herself down and does what the adjunct needs to do. And so from this point, a reader might expect to see Lorne more stoically, or that she would be a lot more narrow-minded in pursuit of the mission that the Empress has granted her on the continent of Ganabakis. But then, on page 418, we get another indication of Lorne's character development. And it's in reference to that first passage that I quoted. Still, she would not permit any ambivalence to threaten the mission. In this, she was Lacene's, the Empress's, arm, and it was directed not of Lorne's accord, but by the Empress. Thus, she played no role in all this, not as the woman named Lorne. And so in this passage, we see that tightening of Lorne's character. She is acting in the name of the Empress. And so at this point, we would not expect Lorne to really be anything but the arm of the Empress. But then, on page 529, we get another instance of character development for Lorne, as stated by the author. She realized that the doubts that had plagued her, borne on those dark wings of knowledge, now lay quiescent. Perhaps she'd moved unconsciously beyond them. When the time for action comes, all doubts must be discarded. She knew herself well, and she knew how to control all that was within her. She was ready for the mission. And with this realization, the weight on her shoulders vanished. So you might start to see what I mean by repetitive character development. This is the third instance of Lorne shutting herself down and trying to move past her worries as a person and to act as the Empress's arm. It seems as though she hasn't been in tune with her own development. There's only been a couple instances in the book where Lorne has either shown doubt or has shown something other than, dedication to her mission. And because of that, being reminded of this constant development in her, where she's supposed to be shutting herself down and acting as the Empress's arm, that really creates some cognitive dissonance for the reader. They know Lorne as thinking one thing, but they also know Lorne as acting another way. And so it just feels inconsistent when all of this is told to us, and yet we don't really see that affect her outwardly. We don't see that affect her actions or the way she interacts with a character. Now, one might say that Lorne as a character, that's how she's supposed to be. She's supposed to have these inner doubts, but outwardly she presents the same stoic personality that's very consistent. And I agree with that. I think Lorne is supposed to be that kind of character where she is struggling to come to terms with what the Empress wants and what she wants and thinks is right. This character development issue happens most clearly with Lorne, but this happens with every character in the book. And so when you have all of the characters developed in this point-blank direct way, and their actions don't necessarily follow the development that's supposedly taking place in their thoughts, it becomes jarring for the reader, and it disconnects the reader from the characters themselves. And so because of that, I wasn't able to really connect with characters the way I think Erikson might have wanted the reader to. And I was very interested in following them and seeing what happened and seeing what events took place. But I wasn't invested in the characters themselves. If one died or if one got resurrected or something like that, it didn't really matter to me one way or another. I just wanted to see how the events leading up to that point would then ripple outwards. And so finishing the book, I can definitely say that this is a good read. Despite the qualms that I had with the character development, I was very invested in what was happening in the book. I was really invested in the events, and I was invested most heavily in the world building. The world building is Gardens of the Moon's greatest asset. It is a lush, vibrant, fleshed out world that has so much more to offer than just this first book shows you. And Erikson makes that abundantly clear. I think that's part of the reason why the steep learning curve that I mentioned earlier is not necessarily a bad thing if you like high fantasy. In fact, I think it really adds to the world building that you as a reader have to figure it out for yourself. There's a lot of different, a lot of peoples, a lot of religion, lore, and history that is really important to this world, and you can tell it's important. And so if there's anything that would motivate me to read more of these books, it would be the world building. Unfortunately, that is the only thing that would motivate me to read the rest of them. If the character development continues as it has in this first book, I would not be very interested in the characters themselves. I also would not expect to enjoy the books from a story-based perspective, I would say. The story itself has a lot of different plot threads going on. Some of them are handled well, and some of them are not. Especially at the end of this book, there seemed to be some confusion as to which plot threads were the most important. And so there seemed to be misplaced tension and hype near the end of this book. And sometimes there was tension that should have been there, but it wasn't. And so I enjoyed the book mostly for the world building. Not too much for the characters, not too much for the story itself, accepting, different plots that happened and wanting to know what comes next. But in a vacuum, the only thing that would really motivate me to read more of these books And the single largest contributor to my enjoyment was the world building aspect. So general rating, I would give it a 7 out of 10. It's good, but again, there are some issues with it that I have. I would recommend this book for anyone who enjoys high fantasy or world building. If world building is your favorite part of reading, then you will love this book. If you are, so about world building, or it's really not your favorite thing when it comes to reading, then I don't think that you would enjoy this, and I would not pick it up. I don't know if I'm going to read the rest of the series. It is a long series, and the books are thick, relatively speaking. So I don't know if I will ever get to the second book. Part of me wants to learn more about the world, and part of me doesn't really want to deal with it. So we'll see how it goes. But hopefully this will give you guys a better idea of if you would enjoy this book or not. That's all I have to say about Gardens of the Moon. I hope that you found this review helpful, and if you go and pick it up, I hope you enjoy the book. So feel free to come and see another book review. I've got a couple in the works, and I also plan on doing a deeper analysis of 1 or 2 books that I've read recently, which I will also send reviews out first. So with that, I hope that you got something out of this, and at the very least, I'm talking to myself. So if you'd like to see me talk to myself about books I've read, then feel free to eavesdrop. Until then, see you later.